have like assistance through the college application process, or was there just kind of like a few meetings and you're on your own?
A few meetings. I think you can ask for further assistance if I wanted to like go and say, help me like with this application. I'm sure they could have. I never took advantage of that, but from what I experienced, it was a couple of meetings. But I think they could have been more hands-on. I just personally didn't go through that.
Mm-hmm.
My mom also was like, we do things on ourselves. So they were like, we're going to figure it out. So that also could have been why.
Do they have any sort of guidance for students who might not be attending college after high school? Do you know about that?
The high school really was geared towards going to college.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were there and you knew you didn't want to go, they did actually try to encourage you to try other high schools because they have a lot of like college specific resources. They felt like you might not, if you don't need it, then you shouldn't spend time doing it.
Mm-hmm.
You can also do dual enrollment, which is like where you can like go to the community college and like do credits adjoining your high school credits, so you can leave with an associate's degree when you're graduating from high school, which can be very cost effective. So there were options, but most of the time they would encourage you to kind of go in a different direction. Because they really were focused on college.
Oh, okay. Well, it sounds like they got you off to one.
They got me here, so I appreciate it.
They shipped you there. All right, now one last question, just a big look back. If you were appointed superintendent of the schools that Natalie Brown had attended previously, and you could make any changes for students in the future, what do you think you would make?
That's a big question. As you know, I would think about. This doesn't sound very oppositional, but I think that providing opportunities for students with different learning experiences and different like levels, like I think a lot of the reasons why I was not the ideal student were not because I didn't want to learn. It was because I felt bored or not engaged or just felt a little bit ahead and I just needed to be challenged. So having different levels of challenge for different students, I think would be a good thing. And then in high school, I think what we're talking about with tracking, like starting like small decisions can lead to like huge background. I'm gonna say disparities. I think it's not necessarily the same thing, but just like being able to like minimize those differences, I think could be a positive thing. I think it's also good to have specialization. Like if you want to do like math out the wazoo, then I think if you want to focus on that, you shouldn't have to like be behind if you want to move forward. But I think there should also be opportunities for students that are behind to move forward. So I think it's more like the latter that I'm worried about. Because if you're going to do integrals and differential equations all day, have at it. But someone else might also want to too, and they got to bring a chair up to the table. Yeah,
absolutely. All right, well, thank you so much for sharing today. It was great to hear about all your experiences.
Thank you. I hope you really be here. I appreciate it. It was really, really interesting to talk about and a lot of interesting reflection. Wow, I'm going to journal about this later.
Bringing a lot of memories back.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, God. That's what we do. That's what we do here at Pencils Down. We dig up old memories and bring them to the surface.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much for being with us today. Lastly, for today, we have the Chicago Policy Review, where we interview a writer from the Chicago Policy Review about a recent article they published. The review article will probably be about education policy, but if it's not, we'll try to make them talk about education anyway. Today, we are joined by staff writer Allison Swimmer, who spoke with us about an article she recently published about how schools are addressing mental health challenges as students are transitioning back from virtual school to in-person education. Allison, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's jump right in. What mental health issues have schools been seeing with students returning to in-person education after the COVID pandemic?
I think mental health in schools can kind of fall into two buckets. I think we can think about the actual day-to-day functioning and executive functioning of students, such as knowing how to find a group member, knowing how to be a leader, knowing when it's appropriate to raise your hand and go to the bathroom. So that kind of falls into the social emotional health versus the actual mental health, which I think is increased levels of depression and anxiety that emerged not only in children, but widespread through all sectors of the population from the pandemic.
And has there been a difference kind of in the age range? Like are younger students and older students seeing mental health issues come about indifferently?
Yeah, I think they manifest in different ways. I think for older students, it might result more in a lack of motivation in terms of schoolwork, a lack of a will to try hard, an inability to organize yourself and be motivated to perform well in school. And I think in younger students, it might emerge in just more keeping to yourself, not being as willing to take risks, not being as willing to put yourself in new situations that might be novel to you. And I think on both ends of the spectrum, they are pretty detrimental in terms of long-term outcomes.
Absolutely. Now, the technological divide was a big topic during COVID, as some students had access to technology and connection capabilities that not every other student did. How did this technological divide impact students and their connection to mental health resources, both over pandemic and now coming back?
I think there are both positive and negatives in terms of technological use during the pandemic. I think in some cases, access to technology was actually a really helpful tool in terms of connection during the pandemic. I think for others, sometimes online learning made students retreat into themselves and they didn't really know how to be successful in a remote setting. Number one, given a lack of structure or accountability to attend class or do work. I think oftentimes too, because school kind of was this thing that just existed behind a screen rather than being physically in the space, there were a lot of competing priorities at home, such as caring for a sibling or helping out around the house for some older students. I was actually a high school teacher during the pandemic. I taught remotely the entire year. And that was something that I saw a lot, was that students were unable to give their full attention to class and to their work because they oftentimes became the primary caretakers for their younger siblings because their parents were essential workers, and so they weren't at home to care for younger siblings. And so it wasn't unusual for me to get a message via Zoom, private chat, saying, "Hey, Miss Swimmer, I need to go change my baby sister's diaper. I'm going to have my camera off for a minute." And so I think it was really hard to fully be a student at certain times for students because they weren't physically in the space and they weren't being held accountable for doing what was being asked of them. I know from a teacher point of view too, it's a lot easier to hold students accountable when you can stand over them and say, okay, I gave you a prompt, your fingers should be moving on your keyboard. You can't really do that when you're sitting in your bedroom behind a screen and your students are halfway across the city.
Yeah, we don't have the technology for that yet.
Unfortunately, not yet. Hopefully it's in the works.
Frankly, nor would we want that technology.
Precisely.
I imagine. Great. So now students are coming back to schools, and a lot of schools have mental health resources for students and supports for students before the pandemic, but obviously now they're dealing with a whole new range of issues. How have some schools rethought the in-person mental health supports that they're providing for students?
So schools have received new funding structures post-pandemic or since the start of the pandemic. And I think several schools have hired school counselors to account for this and more social workers, which I think is definitely a step in the right direction. However, I think it's very rare to see the increased hiring of social workers be proportionate to the student populations. And so I'm sure that these social workers are spread really thin. And the other thing with social workers is that a lot of times students need to opt in to seeing them. And that takes a certain level of maturity and self-awareness that I think a lot of younger students probably lack, or even high school students are somewhat embarrassed to acknowledge or don't really have the emotional capacity to acknowledge. I think in some communities too, there is a large stigma around mental health, and so it's not discussed as openly as it should be, which is, I think, a whole other topic of conversation. But additionally, I think some schools have built extra time into the day for community building and for restructuring and really making sure that icebreakers are being done at the beginning of the year. And there is a sense of safety that's instilled in students, because I think that's something that was really lost during the pandemic, is that oftentimes schools are places where students feel safe, sometimes, unfortunately, more safe than their own homes. And so making sure students feel that when they walk into the building, that you have teachers who care for you, you have peers who care for you, and this is a place where you can take risks and grow, is something that's must be at the forefront of classrooms right now. I also know on a personal level, the charter school organization that I used to work for is currently using a technology platform called YouWill, and I think it has certain modules that focus on things like time management and sleep, and it's provided by the school, and I think there's designated time during advisory or during homeroom during the day where students can make this connection between day-to-day functioning and their decisions and on long-term outcomes and happiness. And they can also connect with professionals online. I know there are several pretty popular platforms that are more geared towards adults as well. But I think having a designated time and space in the school day, number one, normalizes it and says this is something that we all should absolutely be paying attention to. And number two, makes it a priority by the school.
Absolutely. Now, coming back from COVID, obviously schools are facing students who are experiencing mental health challenges, but also they're dealing with a lot of students who have suffered learning loss during this 1 year or have learned less during the pandemic year than they would have if they were in school. How are schools balancing these twin challenges of additional mental health supports needed while also additional academic supports needed?
I think the unfortunate reality is that it's really hard to do, and most schools probably aren't balancing it very well. I think it's a really big question of where to allocate resources. If schools have larger budgets, do they allocate those extra resources to extra tutoring or to extra school counselors? And I think something that schools need to keep top of mind, some do it better than others, is that there are places where the whole student is being formed and the whole child is being formed. It's not just what you see on the academic record. It's not just how you get along with your peers. It's the whole picture. And so you need to strike a very delicate balance of the two and knowing what to dedicate time to when. I think, unfortunately, mental health is probably lacking the attention it deserves, given the large gaps of the mislearning that occurred. And I think that then leads into a conversation about curriculum and standards and thinking about who decides what is now grade appropriate if essentially the entire country is in different places, and seeing whether benchmarks will be shifted at all, and if we need to squeeze so much curriculum into the day. When and how do we make space for students to feel safe and to acknowledge any emotional distress that they may be feeling?
Yeah, it sounds like the incentives might not always be aligned for that. Just in schools right now are held accountable on reading scores and math scores, but they're not held accountable on how mentally well and healthy and growing their students are.
Yeah, and I think that leads into a conversation too of school ratings and how schools are assessed, because I would argue that the highest performing schools are the ones where students not only get into college, but are able to persist through college because they are able to advocate for themselves. They know how to attend office hours. They know how to write a professional email. It's not just the grade on the paper. It's those kind of life skills too. And unfortunately, there is no numerical number that you can attach to that in terms of these ratings, which is essentially how schools receive their funding too. So it's all this kind of intertwined web where it really is this cyclical phenomenon where it comes down to grades and test scores and funding, but those are just numbers on a page that don't speak to the actual humans behind those numbers.
And now, kind of to zoom out a little bit, these new policies that schools are taking into account, these new supports that they're given, are they driven by more local action, or are you seeing action at the state or federal level, whether it's to provide funding or to provide guidance and curriculums? Kind of what is the scope of the main policy push?
Yeah, so I think your question kind of gets at the issue with education in this country, is that it is so fractured in terms of who determines what. There are things that are determined at the federal level, there are things that are determined at the state level, and there are things that are determined at the local level, and there is no widespread norming on it. I think curriculum often does come down to state and federal, whereas the funding comes down to local and is tied to property taxes. And so in terms of local budgets and municipalities, I know that especially in the city of Chicago, as I have to imagine is the case with any other urban area, that there's a lot of updated budgeting from COVID, and there are different resources being allocated in different places. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see where schools decide to invest their money. I think a lot of schools are investing right now in extra high dosage tutoring for after school performance for students who are performing below grade level at present. But I do think some money should be invested in social workers, in platforms that students are able to use to address mental health and just to aid in executive functioning, rather than only be so narrowly focused on test scores and focused on grades. But I think that too, to zoom out, gets at the purpose of schooling as a whole, right? The purpose of knowing how to, the purpose of going to school is knowing how to think critically and knowing how to be a successful citizen in our unpredictable society, and knowing how to navigate uncertainty and navigate changes. Our world continues to change rapidly on a daily basis. And if you don't know how to navigate that with a critical lens and an open mind, you won't be successful regardless of how good you are at chemistry or algebra. And so thinking about what is our core role here and how can schools accomplish that, I think will allow for more equitable funding and a more appropriate balance of time and resources in schools. Ultimately, what it comes down to is talking to the people on the ground and knowing how teachers are feeling, knowing how students are feeling, and knowing how families are feeling. Because I think schools sometimes lack the strong partnership with the families that they need. And if those who are in positions of power don't fully understand how the constituents are feeling and how the people on the ground are feeling, then no problem will ever be solved.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like we have some big challenges ahead, as always, for public education. But based on your research and article, it looks like there's some schools that are doing well and hope